Aladdin is not a real story. It is one of the short story of a long book called 1001 Nights. Fan Theory of Aladdin Part 5. Be sure to subscribe and feel free to check all of the other videos I have made about Aladdin. Hello viewers. How are you? Welcome to Nibir Network. Today our discussion topic is, Aladdin is not an individual story. This story has come from the Arab or Egypt. It's one of the short stories narrated by one of the wisest queens of the Agrabah. Okay, so my theory needs a bit of background info laid out before I can get into it. Specifically, it's based on the movie's source material book, 1001 Nights. So for those of you who don't know what it's about, it's one of the original story within A stories. This is a really simple version of the premise. Once upon a time, there was an evil king named Shahryar. Now one day, Shahryar discovered that his wife had been cheating on him. And not being one to stand for that sort of thing, he devised an elaborate scheme of never to be cheated on again. Every night, he would marry a virgin, so he could have sex with them, and then in the morning, he'd execute his new wife, giving her no chance to cheat on him. Reasonable. So he does this, and murders a whole bunch of virgins. But one night, the virgin he happened to marry was a clever girl named Scheherazade. And she had a plan of her own. You see, Scheherazade was a masterful storyteller. So after she married Shahryar and they boned, Scheherazade began to tell her new husband one of her juiciest stories. It was so juicy that she spent all night telling it, and Shahryar got hooked. Eventually, morning came, aka the appointed time of Scheherazade's execution, but she hadn't finished telling the story. In fact, she'd left it on a big cliffhanger. Shahryar couldn't bear not to know what happened next, so he decided to postpone Scheherazade's execution for just one day so he could tune in the next night and hear how the story ended. But, of course, Scheherazade doesn't finish her story the next night either. She leaves it on another cliffhanger. So the execution is postponed another day, and so it continues for, you guessed it, 1001 nights. Because making up so many cliffhangers for the same story is hard, Scheherazade sometimes had the characters in her story tell completely different stories of their own, and then the characters in those story told stories of their own as well, so she basically set things up so that as long as she could think of a story, any story, she could stay alive. And that's how we ended up with the story within a story thing. It's a really cool way to make a framing narrative, is my point. So, back to Aladdin. Now, Disney doesn't exactly have a great track record with sticking to their source material, and for good reason. They wouldn't be great, feel-good family movies if they did. And thankfully, the 1001 Nights Aladdin is used only very lightly as source material. But what if Disney is actually really faithful to the source material in another way? What if the Aladdin we see in the movie is meant to be interpreted as one Scheherazade's stories? The movie becomes a little bit more interesting if you keep that in mind for your next watch through. The idea that Aladdin might just be one of Scheherazade's inventions is actually fairly well supported throughout the movie. And it also accounts for the anachronism and the genie's meta-awareness. It's not because the genie himself is meta-aware, it's because the storyteller is. The first piece of evidence is right at the beginning of the movie. Remember, the movie doesn't actually start with Aladdin stealing a loaf of bread. It starts with some guy trying to sell you a lamp who then segues into telling you Aladdin's story. So even without the Scheherazade thing, Aladdin might just be a made-up story to make us want to buy this lamp. The second point to consider is the themes in Aladdin. The big one is definitely the idea of being trapped. You might recall that both Aladdin and Jasmine just feel so trapped. If it seems strange to suggest that a literal vagrant and a slightly discontented princess troubles are even slightly alike, of course it is. Unless, of course, the person making that comparison is a princess herself, and she wants to make her audience sympathetic towards suffering princess types. In other words, the themes in Aladdin, and the choice of characters, we're made to sympathize with, are in line with Scheherazade, trying to get Shahryar to have a change of heart. So, Scheherazade makes up the story of Aladdin specifically to show that trapping people is wrong. And furthermore, that happy endings come to those who set their slaves free. Those are the big points supporting everything being a part of Scheherazade's story, in addition, of course, to Aladdin literally already being exactly that in the book 1001 Nights. But if you're still with me after that, we take it one step further. If you just want to know about Aladdin, you can stop here. But if you're interested in more 1001 Nights stuff, we can go deeper. Okay, still with me? So the 1001 Nights most people in the English-speaking world know about is the Richard Burton version, so that's the one I'll be referencing. And, at the risk of spoiling a 500-year-old book, this is how 1001 Nights ends. Shahryar finally stops being an evil tyrant and lets Scheherazade live without having to tell him a story with a crazy cliffhanger every night. But the stories she told were so cool that of course they need to get them down in writing. So we actually get a bit of discourse about the making of the actual, physical 1001 Nights book that the reader is holding. It's revealed that it was translated a number of times by different people and then those copies were copied again, transcribed again, and basically just all kinds of messed up in a long game of telephone. What it means is that 1001 Nights isn't supposed to have a definitive version. It's supposed to be far removed from the original and it's supposed to have a lot of mistakes and have lots of parts missing, or added on, for that matter. So what if one of those missing parts is the real beginning of the story? I mean, what if Scheherazade isn't the real meta-narrative? What if Scheherazade herself is just a character in a bigger story told by another storyteller? That would mean that not only is Aladdin not literally real, obviously, and not only is Aladdin not real in the context of the, already not real, movie, but maybe that reality isn't real either. Or in English, what if Aladdin is just a character in the merchant's story and the merchant is just a story in Scheherazade's story, and Scheherazade is just a character in someone else's story? And so on and so on. I think there's actually some strong evidence to support it. First is the stuff we already mentioned, that the book literally tells us that there are bits of the story almost certainly missing and changed. Then, there's the fact that even before Scheherazade begins her story within a story tirade, i.e. when we're reading the framing narrative of Shahryar and Scheherazade, Scheherazade's father takes her aside to tell her his own story in a way that is very similar to the way in which Scheherazade tells her story within a story. Maybe people just told a lot more stories back then, or maybe Scheherazade's father is just another character in the bigger story, who's being used to kill time and delay the real storyteller's execution. Not to mention, before Scheherazade's story begins, we're following Shahryar and his brother, and there's another non-sequitur story involving people being kept captive by a completely different genie, which sounds a lot like the sort of story you would make up to keep yourself from being decapitated. And then, lastly, and perhaps most cool of all, are the opening 2 words of the entire book, and afterwards. That's how the book actually starts. You can contrive any number of meaning from these words, but here's a plausible one. Given everything we've spoken about before, what if the and afterwards isn't really the start of the story? What if it's a bit left over from one of the parts of the story that were lost to time? 1001 Nights starts like it's continuing a story that came before. And maybe it is. Scheherazade and Aladdin are just the smallest fractions of the 1001 Nights universe. And who knows where it ends? Thanks for watching. Feel free to check all of the other videos I have made about Aladdin. If you like the video, please subscribe to my channel, hit the like button below, and please don't forget to share with your friends.